Good evening, everyone. It is so great to see everyone in this brand new year, 2022. Here's to hoping it's a much better year than our predecessor, but let's move beyond that. Welcome to Busboys and Poets Books presents. Today's guest, I know I don't have to do an introduction, but I'm going to anyways, a small one. But before that, my name's Lori. I'm the Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books, which is a socially conscious, social justice oriented bookstore here in Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia. So each time we have one of these, we invite an author out to speak about their most recent release, their thoughts, their dreams, their aspirations, all of that. And tonight we are so honored to host Angela Davis and Gina Dent. Now, both of these folks are just incredible, fantastic, amazing. I could throw out even more synonyms of those kinds. But without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and bring them on screen. Welcome, y'all. And joining us is also Andy Shalal, the owner of Busboys and Poets. And I'm going to disappear now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Lori. It's also Happy New Year to everybody. And it's a pleasure to have with us, of course, this very first book event, having Angela Davis and Gina Dent here. Great speakers, authors. Angela Davis is an activist, scholar, and author. She is an outspoken advocate for Black liberation, prison abolition, and the intersectionality of race, gender, and class. Her work does not stop at borders. As an internationalist, she speaks out against social injustice throughout the globe, most notably on issues around Palestine and the rights of Palestinians. We'll be talking about the third edition of her autobiography, a great book and a great read. And with us, of course, is Gina Dent. She's an associate professor of feminist studies, history of consciousness, and legal studies at UC Santa Cruz. She is the editor of Black Popular Culture, as well as the co-author, along with Angela Davis, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie, of the other book we'll be talking about today, which is Abolition Feminism Now. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you both. I know we were planning to have a New Year's Eve celebration that was unfortunately postponed, delayed, whatever, for another time due to some of the issues, of course, we're having here with COVID. And I wish everyone the best of health this new year, and everybody to get their shots and get boosted, because that's the only way we're going to get through this, it seems like. So I hope everyone is on it. So thank you all for being here. I want to start with Angela. I know your autobiography, this is the new release. And what made you want to release a third edition? What was the impetus behind that? Is that your publisher, of course, wanting to have it done?
Hi, Andy. Yeah, I was going to say that it wasn't actually my idea to re-release the autobiography. It was a project that was presented to me by the publisher, and but I'm glad it's out again. In connection with the republication, I had the opportunity to read the entire book. First of all, I read it silently, and then I read it aloud for the audio version. And I learned a lot. There were things I had forgotten, and there were things that embarrassed me terribly. My response was, how could I have possibly written something like this? But it was an indication of the degree to which very little has changed. And at the same time, a great deal has changed.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we're a society that is focused on the individual, right? We love our superheroes, the homeless person who made it out of poverty to make it big, or the welfare recipient who got a scholarship to go to an Ivy League school or something like that, and so on. The focus on the individual oftentimes leaves out the important work of coalition building to create that structural change that we talk about. So it's kind of ironic we're talking about an autobiography, right? I mean, that's the interesting thing about this, but so much can be learned by reading it. First of all, if I could say, and this is not just stuff I'm saying, the writing is beautiful. You are a great creative writer, I have to say. I read it a long time ago, and I reread it this time for us to have this gathering. And your prose is just beautiful, and it's not like you're an academic read. You know what I mean? It's just something really really fun to read. So I want to put that out there. But I want to ask you a little bit
Well,
more about.
let me say from the very outset that this is a book that was edited by Toni Morrison.
Yes.
So that has something to do with the way it reads. Not so much a book written by Toni, but edited by her. And I can remember now that we're speaking about this, the many times when she would read a draft that I had written, and she would ask me, "Well, what did you feel like? What else was in the room? Describe the room. What color were the walls? What else was there?" And so she was the person who kind of urged me out of my academic style of writing. If only for the experience that I had working with Toni Morrison, I am so happy that I wrote this autobiography, which incidentally is more of a collective autobiography. I tried to focus as much as possible on what was achieved by people who were associated with the movement, and tried, even as I wrote this autobiography, which as a genre is reflective of the individual, I tried to deflect attention away from me exclusively and shine attention, shine the light on all of the other people who were involved in the process of building these movements that did bring about change.
I'll go back to the movement building and all that stuff. But you mentioned Toni Morrison. Of course, she was the editor of at Random House then. But can you talk a little bit about your relationship to her? How did you get to connect with her, and how did this project come about? Because you were what, 28 at the time?
Yeah, I was 28. I had just been released from jail, and what I did not know at that time about Toni Morrison was that she had decided that she was going to assist in the process of leaving a historical record of the liberation movement at that moment. And so she not only made the suggestion that I write an autobiography, she worked with Muhammad Ali and George Jackson and Tony K. Bambara and so many others. So that was her contribution to the movement, creating this historical record.
Mm-hmm. You wrote you wrote it in 1974, correct? That was when it was published?
No, actually, it was published in 1974.
Yes.
Toni approached me, I think, towards the end of 1972. And I spent all of 1973 writing the book. And I think my chronology may be a bit off, but it was a process that took a very long time.
And it's, as you mentioned, it's much of what you wrote is the same, and much of it has changed. You mentioned in your writing that there was a possibility that more people, black, white, yellow, red, and brown, and you use those terms, might be inspired to join the growing community of struggle against all forms of injustice. Only if this happens that I will consider this project worthwhile. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about that at this moment in time? Do you think the project was worthwhile?
Yeah, I do think it was worthwhile, both in terms of the way it revealed the strengths of the movement, but also in terms of the ways in which it revealed the flaws. As I read it this time, I read it as a historical record, as a record of the movement at that time. There was so much we did not know. And I cringed at the language I used in certain passages that was reflective of what we understood to be the case at that time.
Yes.
So I think it's also important as a testament of how much things have changed.
Much of it, of course, revolves around your experience when you were imprisoned. And I know that obviously that experience shaped you politically and intellectually, right? You said that while being incarcerated, you became keenly aware of gender dynamics in social justice. And I want to be able to move toward the other book that we're talking about here, which is the latest book that I'm holding up here, Abolition Feminism Now, and it's written, of course, with yourself and Gina Dent, who's here with us, Erica Miners, and Beth Ritchie. And the book speaks about that intersectionality between feminism and the abolition of prisons and the carceral system. Can you speak how you came about to make those connections, and why are those connections so important? And I want to be able to go to you, Angela, and then to Gina to speak a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, I think at that time and this is how I framed the short preface to the third edition of the book, that I was really just beginning to develop an awareness of the importance of gender and issues of sexuality. I can remember that during the period of activism that precedes my incarceration, we always use the term "the Black man" to encompass the entire Black community. And although, of course, there were ways in which we were beginning to develop an awareness of the importance of gender, that didn't really happen for me. I think maybe I was behind the times in the sense that there were other formations. I'm thinking about the Combahee River Collective, which we discuss in the book, that had a more advanced understanding of gender and sexuality at that time. But for me, it was the time I spent in jail that allowed me to explore gender. I wrote several articles that represented my initial efforts to grapple with questions of the relationship between gender and race. When I was in jail, as I point out in the preface, I was asked at one point to provide a statement for an abortion rights rally. And what I attempted to do was to bring in the question of sterilization abuse and the ways in which Puerto Rican women and Indigenous women and Black women experience what we now call reproductive justice within a larger framework. And because I wrote the statement in that way, they refused to read the statement because they took the position that, well, this doesn't really have anything to do with abortion rights. You're writing about sterilization abuse. So I was beginning to develop an awareness while I was in jail of the need to bring these issues together and to talk about interrelationalities and intersectionalities. And of course, here we are now in we're 2022, and we're still grappling with those questions. And of course, Gina and Erica and Beth and I decided to write this this book precisely because of the need to show how feminism has deeply influenced the development of abolitionism, and how abolitionism really cannot achieve its fullest potential without a powerful feminist dimension, and that is to say, anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism.
Gina, I want to turn to you also about the connection. You know, this is your life's work, of course, and speaking about the abolition of prisons and the prison industrial complex as we know it, and the intersection of feminism. How do the two link together?
Well, I think what we've been learning over all these years is that they're always linked together. We just don't always perceive that. And if we don't perceive it, we do so at our peril. So the book is really partly about that, about the need to yoke these movements together, to see them really as one movement. And also, we were really thinking about the fact that of how our histories get documented, they get visually represented, they acquire historical status, and then there's always this work afterward to include other people who've been excluded. In the case of the Black movements that we know about from the 60s and 70s, that was sometimes women, but also sometimes other people of color and even white people who were involved with those movements who are scrubbed from our visual records, who are scrubbed from our histories. So for us, we really spent a lot of time talking about the people that we've known in this movement for all of these decades. Angela, of course, more time than I have been in the movement, and how they represented especially the vision of queer, trans, folks and women of color primarily, and people who came from the very movements that are often named as alibis for increasing incarceration, namely those people in the anti-domestic violence movement. And so we really wanted to demonstrate that, in fact, people who've been intimately connected to working against domestic violence have been persuaded that their work was not successful unless it became abolitionist. And we wanted to include the names of people and organizations who had really laid the foundation for the work of abolition now, so that we wouldn't arrive at a time when it could be represented as being a movement only of a few, and only of a few who represented a kind of liberal strain in the movement. So I think those are the things that are important. And for me, this is really, I've never been in any social justice movement that hasn't included kind of both sides of this, the interpersonal and the structural. I remember even back to being in college, I was, one of those people. I was the only one who worked at both the Women's Center and what was then called the Third World Center. And, I had nicknames on both sides. My nickname on the Third World Center side was Ms. And I think it's now really indicative of how all the younger people are operating. But we also know that even if that's the case now, the representation of this period might not contain the understandings that are generated from that very intersectional framework. So that's what we really wanted to do. Oops. Muted?
You're muted.
I've got this new little puppy here for people to see. and she's a little bit getting feisty. So just one second.
She likes class.
Yeah. trying to get Marjan to uptake. This was a mistake to start this when they're next to me. It's coming down. It's not for her wrong. What was that? The puppy's name is Yara, which means friend. It means friend in Farsi.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Hey, Marjan, come take her. Excuse me, folks. I apologize. Here you go. Go. All right. She's gone. Yes. Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about that idea of intersectionality that we oftentimes use, where we put there's always this dichotomous paradigm we place, on things. And that's, it's black or white, it's this or that, it's defund the police, or it's fund the police, so that we don't have a clear understanding oftentimes of these issues, and we end up creating these paradigms that people just polarize on opposite ends, and we don't seem to be able to move forward. How do we break away from that polarization that we oftentimes kind of revert to, because that seems to be the way that we like to think of things?
Mm-hmm.
For both of you, I really would like to, because a lot of these issues we get stuck in, and I think one of the reasons why we get stuck in these issues and we don't seem to move the dialogue as freely as we should or could is because we create these polar opposites. And when you try to find something in the middle, you're shunned by both sides, and nobody wants to be, nobody wants to move the ball in any direction or create a brand new vision. I mean, you're creating a brand new vision with this idea of abolition, but oftentimes when you tell people about abolition, and they say, well, what does that mean? And you say, well, we want to stop your prisons, and they say, well, what are you going to do then? The world will just turn upside down. But obviously there's much more to it, and I encourage people to read it, to read the book, because it really has specific concrete things that could be done. Can you speak a little bit about that idea?
Well, yeah. Let's see who's first. You can go.
Well, why don't we go to Gina first, and then you, Angela, if you don't mind.
I was only going to say a small thing to start, which is just that I like the way you're framing this, Andy, and it's really important to us. I think it's important to us as activists and as professors, because, of course, we're busy in the work of trying to get people to understand the nuance of things and the difficulty of reading histories and understanding the present. And that's part of how we always think. So it made me, when you said that people are in the middle, right? And what about the middle? We are, of course, trained in dialectics. We actually don't tend to think about the middle being, so it's not sort of meeting based on the common terms that both of those sides have, but rather disrupting the common sense that establishes the two sides. And so this book really is in that tradition of saying, all of these people, all of these organizations, they don't agree on everything. They don't agree on every fine point. But we tried to be inclusive of everything we felt expressed the yearning to be rid of these polarized oppositions and the binaristic way of thinking of things. And so I think that is what the abolition that we are talking about, and the abolition feminism that we're talking about, is really about. It's about the capacity to and we're thinking about a moment when, for example, Adrienne Maree Brown writes about cancel culture, right? We're not canceling anyone in our movement. We're not trying to be better than someone else. We're not trying to say these are the appropriate leaders or these are the people you should follow, but really trying to say how important it is for us to notice all of the people that sometimes we even discount, that we are learning from and that are important here, and all of the different ways they're trying, and also sometimes failing, right? We're always trying and failing to try and imagine a better world and try to build that world. And so I think for us, we were really just trying to let that way of being be something that could show up. We live in a country which is deeply anti-intellectual. That's not always the case. Angela and I travel a lot around the world, and we do this anti-prison work in many, many places. And when we're outside of the US, the vocabularies that we use are usually accepted and not really challenged, even with audiences that do not, where their language is not, first language is not English. But in the United States, we're supposed to often have like a single point to say, or one, takeaway, or one way to fix something, which, comes from the fact that a lot of us have been discouraged from being intellectually curious, and of knowing that the more you know you don't know, and that's part of what it means to try to be in this world in a complex way. And so that the book has, I think, the feeling that four people trying to write together who agree about a vision but don't have, are also very different. We wrote differently. We think about different things. We've been in different parts of the movement, and so trying to work on this together was really also an example of the movement, right? The way we had to let our individual voices go, and we were always trying to hear from other people in the group. And also when somebody was sick or somebody couldn't do something or didn't have childcare, whatever it was, someone else was always filling in. And it was an amazing feeling of doing this, which made me really invested again in the idea that we can build a different society. The way we were living with each other doing this book is the way I would hope to live for everyone in this world.
Did you find any surprises in the process?
Oh,
Many.
yes.
Lots of, huh?
I'll let Angela talk about this.
Yeah.
Well, I want to go back and remind me about the surprises later, but I want to go back
All right.
and address the original question, Andy, and point out that I was trained as in critical theory. I was a student of critical theory, and one of the real advantages of having learned critical theory at a very young age is that I learned how to question not only the text that I read, but the ideas that I encounter. I learned how to always question my own ideas. I learned how not to be so attached to what I think and what I believe that I cannot engage my own self in criticism, and I think this is what we did throughout the process. I was actually going to share a passage that we included in the book from the critical race theorist, and she really is one of the major scholars of critical race theory. Let me say that again. She is one of the major scholars of critical race theory, which is not taught to children, by the way. Her name is Mari Matsuda. She's an amazing scholar. And so this is a passage that she wrote in 1991.
Which page are you on? Which page are you on?
Page 3, actually. It's in the introduction on page 3.
Okay.
The way I try to understand the interconnection of all forms of subordination is through a method I call ask the other question. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where is the patriarchy in this?
Yeah.
When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where is the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where are the class interests in this? Mm-hmm. Working in coalition forces us to look for both the obvious and the non-obvious relationships of domination. And as we have done this, we have come to see that no form of subordination ever stands alone.
Beautiful. And I actually had that highlighted and written, and it goes on to say that she has the invocation requires an acknowledgement of the intersectionality of struggles and also represents our willingness to anticipate change and to build into our organizing a critical, generative reflexity and opportunity to learn and grow. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really beautifully written. I mean, just that was like the whole idea of how we can move forward. I mean, this is like a map that you can use on almost everything. So whenever I always, like to replace, sort of different terms and say, how would I feel if, and if it matches and if it's fine, then I think I'm on the right track. But if it doesn't, then I think I'm really, using my own internal biases to make a decision.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
And Andy, we struggled a great deal over how much to include what some might consider to be academic analyses in the text, because we wrote this text in such a way as we hope that it would be accessible to people with varying degrees of preparation, if they are willing to struggle with it. We're not people who say, we have to dumb down our analysis so that other people can understand it, because we think people are capable of understanding difficult ideas, regardless of whether they have been to college or gotten an advanced degree or whatever. And so there are passages in the book that some people will probably have to struggle with.
No, I had to read several twice.
Yeah, and that's a good thing. That's
yeah, exactly. Exactly. I don't like to skip reading. I just find that like, oh, I finished that book. It's like, what'd you learn? Nothing. I just finished the book. You know, for me, no, I would rather read passages and really get into them rather than just finish the book. You know,
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. And rereading something is really special. You know, it's so interesting. I used to say that, you know, the idea of reading the book again is like, what? There's so many books. Why do I want to read them again? They say, do you ever listen to music more than once? Their song?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, you listen to the same song 500 times and you love it and you hear it differently every time. So why not a book?
Exactly.
You know?
That's the analogy that we often use too. So thank you, Andy.
Yeah, exactly. When you like something, really enjoy it. And it's interesting because rereading an important book or a really good book, you learn so much more than just reading a whole bunch of books. You know what I mean? Because if it's well written and if it's analyzed well, it's beautifully written, it's just in itself is rich. You know, it doesn't need to have, you don't need to just do quantity. It's anyway. But I wanted to go back to the surprises. Tell me about the surprises we started talking about.
Well, you know, as Gina pointed out, this book is authored by 4 different individuals who have different histories, who have different connections with academic disciplines and fields, who've been involved in the movement differently. You know, at first we really embraced the idea, and then we thought, oh my God, how are we going to ever do this? We're all so different. We write differently. And the surprise was, the major surprise for me was that the book does not sound like any one of us individually. But it has a voice. It has a voice of its own, and it's a collective voice. It's much more than Gina could have done, much more than I could have done, much more than Erica or Beth could have done. And that was truly surprising to me, because as we struggled with this book, the thing that most concerned me said, how are we going to avoid having this disjointed sounding voice? If I write, you know, one section and Gina writes another section, Erica writes another section, Beth, but reading it finally, and I should point out that Gina actually read it aloud for the audiobook, so that there is an audiobook in the works. It has a voice. It has a voice of its own, and that voice is collective. And what's so important about that is that it kind of replicates the process that we want to see in the movement. How can we bring all of our voices, our talents, our preparation together to create something that is really stunning and powerful, that belongs to all of us, not to any of us individually, but to all of us collectively.
Gina, I want to ask you, I know that a lot of people don't really understand the concept of abolition. I think some people may be listening or you know, and I hope they do buy the book and read it. But even if they hear it from you, they should still read it, because you, as we said, you're learning, and learning is a repetitive process. Can you just give us a synopsis of that?
Sure, I can try. I mean, I think one of the things we did was we layered analogies to historical abolition, so anti-slavery abolition. We layered the connectedness of racial capitalism to the current situation. We took up people's challenges to mass incarceration, which I'll just say, by way of getting to my definition, isn't always abolitionist. because you could reduce mass incarceration or get rid of mass incarceration, but you could leave incarceration as a policy in place. We took all of this as a background to say, what are the ways that we can think about having a society that doesn't depend on carcerality as the ostensible solution to all of our social ills. That means that we're reconciling with the fact that incarceration actually does tremendous amounts of damage. So sometimes we're listing the damage that it does. We also are dealing with the true harms that humans do to each other, which I think in this book we really endeavor never to neglect. So there is a lot about interpersonal harm. But abolitionists are not only thinking about what we should get rid of, meaning we should get rid of prisons, get rid of the prison industrial complex. And by the way, if we say in prison industrial complex, it's a little bit of a giveaway because it doesn't just mean the buildings. It means the whole structure that supports incarceration or that incarceration supports. And so that could be economic, social, cultural, and everything else that is wedded to incarceration as a practice. And so abolition, in the words of some of our colleagues, is both about changing everything, to quote Ruth Wilson Gilmore. It's also about, another quote from Ruthie is, it's about presence, not absence. It's also about what people like Mariam Kaba are doing in terms of thinking about how to have children raised in a way that is non-punitive, have people have imaginations that allow them to think differently about how we create categories in society. So there are a lot of aspects to abolitionist work that are in the small scale areas of our lives. Because in order to actually move ourselves away from the habit of pretending that we're solving social problems with imprisonment, we also have to really deal with how we have a carceral society. And that comes from even the ways we think about punishing children. We've evolved in terms of that. We no longer think that it's acceptable to hit children, for example. But these are all the elements of carcerality that we're starting to challenge socially. And prison abolitionists are really looking ahead to how we would rid our society of all the forms of carcerality. And that includes the interpersonal violences that are also a part of what we treat in this book.
A lot of people what is the role of restorative justice in all of this? I know that your sister Fania, Angela, is very much involved in that process. I know that plays an important role, of course, when he's speaking about abolition. Can you speak a little bit about the idea of restorative justice and how that plays into all this?
Well, absolutely. Gina was referring to the fact that the retributive character of justice that is associated with the existing carceral structures, police and prisons, that notion of justice, that retributive notion of justice, is not even concerned with changing society. It's only concerned with addressing the immediate individual case at hand, leaving everything else intact. And as a matter of fact, using incarceration and the death penalty as the primary responses actually ends up replicating the very violence that this kind of retributive justice pretends to address. And so if we think about justice in a larger context, if we think about justice that will not only address this particular individual case, but that will begin to change social structures, political structures, in such a way as to allow us to envision a society without the kind of violence that we are addressing in this case, a society without gender violence. I mean, this is why it's so important to bring feminism, the anti-racist, anti-capitalist feminism, together with abolition, because the most pandemic form of violence in the world is gender violence. And as much as individual cases have been addressed over, say, the last 40 years, since we've developed an awareness of this publicly, the incidence of gender violence has not changed. It remains exactly the same. And so abolition asks us to raise a different question. How do we create a society in which gender violence no longer becomes the response that people, individuals, men, women, trans people turn to? How do we rid our societies of gender violence as a whole? And this is the way abolition encourages us to think, to stop being so myopic. In a sense, the way in which we address these questions now presumes that the larger violences are always going to be with us. And the only thing we can do is punish the individual. So that very approach to punishment presumes that we're going to live a violent future. And abolition asks us to raise the question, what would be entailed if we want to create a society without this violence? What would we have to do? What changes would we have to make? And then, therefore, we have to pull back and use a much larger lens. We can't just look at the individual case. We have to look at all of the structural elements, the structural racisms, patriarchy. We have to address all of these questions before we can actually answer the abolitionist question.
What societies do it better? I know we do it pretty badly. But what societies, Gina, in your research on this issue, what can we look to? I know that Michael Moore did one time one of his films. He was showing how, I think, Scandinavian countries. I don't remember which one. It does a complete. They have people that have murdered other people who are working in a kitchen at the prison, chopping things up with very big knives and very big, and making dinner, for the other prisoners. And it's open, and there's a pond in front, and there's trees, and there are, animals around, and there are other things that restore, the person back to some kind of humanity that they had lost somewhere along the line. So what other countries are doing this better?
Well, I mean, you mentioned the Scandinavian countries, and it makes sense to start there because they're most documented as embracing a couple of things that are strands of abolition. One thing that is not really abolitionist is the idea that we can make better prisons. And I will say that even as all of us that I know that are involved in the movement still work to improve and ameliorate conditions. However, to answer your question, Scandinavian countries are often lifted up for a number of their policies, including decarceration, really focusing on getting numbers of people outside, of allowing people, even while they're serving a sentence, to participate in community, of not impoverishing people while they're incarcerated, of allowing people to enter back into the workforce. So there are a lot of aspects of our system that make, for example, your conviction of a felony something which imprints upon your life and the life of your family for the entire maybe generation or two or more. And so Scandinavian countries are often looked to for the ways that they have, and I'm going to say a little something more critical, been more interested in trying to think about how to actually change behaviors, transform behaviors, and return people to communities. But part of that's being challenged now is that those countries had been considered more monocultural. And as immigration and different kinds of problems have come to those countries, we have seen, and certainly Angela and I have visited prisons in some Scandinavian countries and have seen the high ratio of people of color inside, as opposed to what you see on the streets. And so I don't want to suggest here that we can look to Scandinavian countries as the solution for us to our problem. I think what Angela's talking about when she talks about restorative justice is really moving away from a system which can even be called justice. And so this is why we use the term criminal legal system as opposed to criminal justice system. A lot of us slip and we say criminal justice system anyway because we're used to saying it. But the reason for that is that our legal system is also the problem. In other words, the system can't just be corrected so that we can have only the guilty people going to prison, only the people who, and they should serve then the accurately calculated amount of time, and they should be, provided certain other like appropriate meals and other things. We could improve all those conditions and we would have a system that treats people more fairly than we do now. But we are really trying to get to imagining a world where we'd cease to think that these forms of extreme deprivation, because being incarcerated is deprivation, even if your conditions are not as poor, are necessary. And so that's really where we're focused. And sometimes we do. I mean, there's an important book by someone whose name, of course, is escaping right, Baz Dreisinger at John Jay, about the writing programs that she's run internationally. And it's actually a beautiful book, which of course the name is escaping me right now. Maybe it'll come, which really talks about Rwanda, parts of Asia and other parts of the world where she's inside working with writing programs. And it's also a book really about the differences between different societies and their relationship to incarceration. Unfortunately, one of the reasons why it's so important for people in the United States to focus on abolition work is that our ideas are often the ideas that are spreading around the world, and they often overtake the local, national attempts to create different kinds of systems and alternatives. We could talk about structural adjustment programs and the way in which the international banking system holds countries to certain standards. And among those standards are certain things that affect legal situations and incarceration. So our role in this is outsized in needing to address incarceration because we have also been spreading it around the world. And our systems of incarceration, our architecture of incarceration, our security protocols, and everything else are spreading very rapidly. So it's up to us to spread abolitionist knowledge as well.
There's also, I think, in this country, a real disdain to people that are imprisoned. I know that for years, and just for the last 2 years because of COVID, we have not been able to do it, but we would serve a Christmas dinner to youth that have been incarcerated. And I remember when I first announced that we were going to be doing that, asking for volunteers, we got a substantial amount of criticism saying, why are you serving these people instead of a homeless person or a person of who's innocent, quote unquote.
Right.
And I was shocked really by the criticism at first, because I thought, what do you mean? Like, these are humans. They obviously something happened. They're damaged. They're traumatized, and that's why they did what they did. And they need love. They need much more than, people are always willing to help a homeless person during the holidays, but these people are never, given that opportunity to feel human again. So that's really interesting how, and it's fascinating how a lot of folks who were critical are people of color. And that I find that fascinating, is even when you're talking about defunding the police, for instance, oftentimes people of color who are saying, no, don't defund the police. We need the police. Look at our neighborhoods. We need them. You can talk about your neighborhood. That's your problem. But we don't want to defund the police. So it's a very similar thing. We're talking here about a paradigm shift that has to happen. How close are we to that paradigm? It takes a lot to poke holes at the current paradigm in order for it to just flip. Are we at that moment of that change to happen? Do you see that?
Well, actually, I think we are closer to that moment than we've ever been.
Mm.
And let me just back up for a moment and emphasize how important it is for us here in the United States to be doing this work against prisons, against the police. Because, of course, the US has the largest incarcerated population in the world. And the largest rate of incarceration in the world, something like one third, I think, of all women who are incarcerated in the U.S. And this is not so much because the U.S. is just a bad nation, and I'm not saying it's a good nation at all, but it's because of capitalism. It's because of the fact that the whole prison system, as it has taken shape in the U.S. Over the last period, and especially since especially since the 1980s, but actually, since the 50s and 60s, but since the 1980s, when global capitalism began to define not only the economies, but the lives of people all over the world, it also chose incarceration as the way of addressing the fact that ever larger numbers of people were being rendered obsolete, were being rendered surplus, were being rendered human beings with no place to turn, no education, no health care. And the solution to this is to build more prisons. And of course, this then serves as a spur to the capitalist economy more broadly. And you have all kinds of companies making money, making profits from the fact that people are imprisoned. So I really want to emphasize the connection of what we call mass incarceration with global capitalism. So in the US, we have a special responsibility because we can see this perhaps more clearly in the US with the racial disparities and the ways in which racism has been used as a driving force for this this experiment in dealing with large numbers of people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people, who are being rendered basically surplus, who no longer have a place in society, who don't have jobs, who don't have the opportunity to get an education, who can't get health care, who can't get mental health care. And so abolition asks us to look at this holistically and not to solve the single problem of police violence or the single problem of mass incarceration, but to understand, again, the interconnections and interrelationality of all of these developments. As a result of the emergence of the prison industrial complex in Africa now, there are vast numbers of prisons in South America, in Brazil, for example. So when we do this work, we do it recognizing that it has international implications and that we are connected with people who are struggling against police violence and against over-incarceration in other parts of the world. But at the same time, precisely because we are located here, we used to call it the belly of the beast, we have to do something about this. We have to make it very clear that we do not accept these capitalist solutions that rely on racism and that rely on transphobia and that rely on patriarchy.
How close are we, Gina? What are the soft spots that the people can go after in order to make this paradigm shift really happen?
Well, One of the things that I remember that we talked about with the very early critical resistance organizing, and that was organizing for a conference that happened in 1998 that we write a little bit about in the book, and there's an organization that developed afterwards. And I remember when I got involved that what was really powerful about it was that everyone was asked to join that conference and to be a part of it from wherever they were. So if you were a nurse, maybe you hadn't considered it before, but you were dealing with the prison industrial complex. And so you would come to that conference and not promise to become an anti-prison activist who would be at meetings every night, if that's not what you could do, but that you would be in your workplace and try to work in that site to for example, make sure that child welfare services worked a certain way and didn't work in a carceral framework, or did things that were consistent with the wanting to get rid of prisons from where you were. School teachers, right? How do we get rid of metal detectors in schools and stop treating children like they're prepared? Certain children, not every child, but certain children like they're just being groomed to go to prison. How do we? How do artists, participate by making work? What I'm saying about this is that what was really important to me about this activism was it wasn't asking everyone to do the same thing. And it wasn't asking people only to be in the streets demonstrating. We really were holding on to the definition of a demonstration is that it's revealing something that otherwise is hidden, but that the rest of the times we were all working wherever we were. So I'm a professor. I do a lot of this work by teaching abolition. I do a lot of this work by teaching legal studies in a framework which suggests that we have a problem with our entire legal system, not just with the fact that we have prisons. And so I think that means that there are all kinds of soft spots, right? There are all kinds of places where people need to be active and can be active in ways that don't have to be so incredibly self-sacrificing or kind of fetishizing of what we think activism is. I think that was what was so exciting to me about the early abolitionist work that I was involved in. And I think it's what keeps people in the work. It's very difficult to have to step away from whatever you do and sort of feel that your only way of being involved in the movement is to do it full time. And then that full time work makes you become a kind of professional activist, which takes you out of other arenas where you can learn and grow. And I think what's been amazing about the anti-prison and anti-police movements is that people are entering from all kinds of places. Some people because they're forced to enter, because they live in communities that are dealing with these problems every day. And some people because they take an interest because they're realizing that, for example, in architecture, you can't get a job unless you want to go into what they call justice architecture. Think about that term. Or which means building prisons. Or you can't get a job doing certain other things, right? You're in California and you find that as a person of color, the most integrated union is the prison guard union, right? So we have to work in all of the places where we already are to make for other opportunities and to make it possible. But that means there are these other possibilities, because then all of us have power, even if we're just raising children and we're raising the children with different understandings in a different way. We're all contributing to abolition. I think what we try to do in the book is to bring these arenas together to show how at a very small scale and at a very large scale, we can do this work, and we can do it without trying to cancel each other out, and by making sure that we are being inclusive. I know one of the things that people are always really concerned about is that a lot of us perceive humans as being just violent by nature, and that we'll always have violence. So we'll always have to plan for having violence, which means we always have to treat violence with violence. And I think we're saying that all of that is something that we have written into society, but we can also write it out. We can imagine differently. We can be in a different place. And that's why I feel really hopeful. A lot of people ask me, like, how can you do this work all the time? How can you talk about this stuff all the time? It's because of the changes that you get to see when you're on the ground with this movement. It's because of the ways that, especially I think young people, watching children who, were born 20 years ago and watching them now in college and beyond, and making an analysis saying, I'm going to choose this job. I'm going to go in this kind of medical care. I'm going to do this with my training, as opposed to what someone might have chosen 10 years ago. That shows me that we have the capacity to change. we also have to realize that we have an incredible resistance to these changes. And so we've got to be ready. And that's why we want to write. And that's why we want to keep speaking about this. And that's why we want to help people prepare, because it takes a lot to fend off the easier solutions that are offered, the ones that are already available. So I like to think of us as having to leapfrog over the solutions. You mentioned that people of color are often the ones who are really invested in the systems. And that's because people of color and poor people are living in the communities that are crime riddled and have the legacies of the violence of slavery and colonialism and incarceration inside our communities. And so, of course, we're often the most afraid. But we've got to figure out other ways not to hope that we can just be incarcerated at the appropriate rate for our kind of people, but that we actually can leapfrog over that as a solution and over that as an idea about what it would mean to really be included as an equal citizen. So for us, this book is really about trying to say, how could we not just keep reinvesting in a system that never, ever, ever will be able to be just to each of us.
And Andy, may I say something?
Please.
I wanted to say, as you were talking about your experience in feeding people in prison, that I remember when we began to do this work, nobody wanted to talk about prisoners. It was as if we were broaching a topic that was so taboo that even people who had relatives behind bars were afraid to publicly disclose. And if we think back to that period, I was just sitting here listening to you and Gina and remembering that there was a time when I wanted to try to encourage discussion around these issues, and people said, "Well, what are you talking about? What do you have to say about prison? You're not a criminologist. You're not a penologist. What authority do you have?" And I would suggest that I might give a lecture at a particular university or college about this issue, and people would say no. And when I look at the difference between that period and where we are now, and in which the culture is almost saturated, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, with information and imagery that is carceral. So I, and also I should say that when we first took up this challenge of building an abolitionist movement, I don't think any of us imagined that we would be where we are today. I don't think any of us imagined that we would ever get to experience in our lifetimes a time when there was public conversation about abolition, when television journalists would be talking about it. Of course, we didn't have social media, so we couldn't, bring that into our analysis at that time. But in many ways, even though we have so far to go, and the conditions that we're seeing with respect to racist police violence and incarceration are so much the same as they've always been. At the same time, the consciousness is radically different. And even as this consciousness emerges, we have to expect that there are going to be challenges, and we have to expect that there are going to be people who say, well, there are all those folks calling for defunding the police, and look at what has happened. Crime has increased in our communities. I mean, this is a part of the process. And abolition urges us to think broadly, to think in temporalities that go further than tomorrow or 10 years from now, and in temporalities that stretch to the past. And in that sense, this is a really exciting period. It's a period that many of us would not have been able to imagine 10 years ago, or certainly when we created critical resistance. We were thinking about, we were thinking about the far future. We were thinking about doing work that would allow people to take up these questions 50 years from now, or whatever. But given the way in which the pandemic and the awareness of structural racism that developed in relation to the confluence of the pandemic and the horrible cases of racist police violence, George Floyd, of course, Breonna Taylor, we were offered a kind of privileged historical moment. And what we're trying to do is to make the very best use of it. We know that we will be pushed backwards, but that does not mean that we cannot also push ourselves forward at the same time.
Is it possible to solve the problem of racist police and the prison system by using the same system that holds those things together? I mean, is it possible to do that? I mean, I know that a lot of changes happen by using the system, but I'm not sure. It seems like there's a inherent limitation to that process.
Yes, but I think one of the things that we try to write about is basically living in multiple temporalities, right? Different kinds of time. So we're not entirely impractical. I know one of the things we write about is that people used to call us, like, you'd say we didn't know what was really going on in the world. We weren't, but we're actually people who've been involved in communities and been fighting against violence for a very long time. So we're very aware of what is bad. But I think the point about living in multiple temporalities is we know that the system we have in place now handles things only in a certain way. So these judgments that we've gotten recently, for example, in the cases around Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd, I mean, those do matter, but they don't end the struggle. They do matter because in the time we're living in the form of time we're living in, those things are the way we measure justice. But we also, as abolitionists, have to live in multiple times. So we try to also live always with the idea of what would we prefer, not only that we don't have the person die at the hands of the police or, in this case, citizens, but that we also have a way of imagining how we would be living completely differently with each other, and that we can somehow keep both of those things in our mind at the same time. And I think abolitionists who've really been in the work for a long time, or the ones who've been able to be lucky enough to be trained into the movement with people who are very aware that you have to take those local opportunities to make changes at the same time as you never lose sight that those are never sufficient. And I think if we can do that, that we feel like is part of what feminism can contribute. Feminists have always been practical like that, right? I mean, it's when we're talking about gendered contributions in the world, and we think about what women's contributions largely have been, it's often been to keep things going even when. And that spirit is really part of the movement. It's a necessary part of the movement. And that's why for us, abolition feminism now is about the fact that we don't think you can do abolition work without this feminist framework. That in fact, if you try to do it without the feminist framework, you'll be missing things. We'll become too punitive. We're too much anti-police rather than pro-us, right? We're too much invested in trying to get justice on the terms of the criminal legal system and not enough in thinking about alternative ways of being together. So we have to be able to do both.
And we also emphasize in the book that this is not just a domestic problem, that we have to take the world into our framework, that we have to think about Palestine and the ways in which the abolition movement has learned a great deal from the carcerality of Palestine, not just the prisons, the Israeli prisons, but the ways in which carceral strategies have been used to control Palestinians under occupation. So, we've learned so much from the experience of Palestinians struggling from justice. We learn from South Africa. We learn from Brazil, and we're trying to challenge the ways in which people in the U.S. are always compelled to think narrowly and only about this country, and about this country as the best example. Even the activists, even the radical activists in this country, oftentimes think of themselves as people who have lessons to teach to those in the global South, the deprived people of the global South. And what we're saying is that we learn from struggles in the global South. We learn from the struggles of the Kurdish people. We learn from the ways in which they have taken on issues of gender in relation to the entire revolution, and have posed them as absolutely central to radical revolutionary social change.
You mentioned, I'm sure, go ahead, Gina.
No, I just Angela inspired me to say something a little bit about our interactions in Palestine and in South Africa. And I think about some conversations. And one of the things I loved about those experiences is that they're really about mutuality and about listening to each other and learning both ways. And I remember one conversation we had in South Africa with people who had become newly empowered after the end of apartheid. And they were in some very high up positions, and they were debating whether or not they should accept funding for a supermax. And we said, it's really important that you not do this, that the more you build prisons, the more you will fill them. And what was important about this story for me is that they were all saying, well, they know that the causes of incarceration were social. And they were saying, we know that crime is social. We know that people who are in prison are not bad people. And they knew that because the movement people had always been incarcerated. They knew that incarceration was racist. But in building a society after apartheid, the same system that had been in place before was now incarcerating people for different reasons. And of course, what's happened in South Africa has become an incredible crisis, which is why so many activists in South Africa are now really fighting against the prison system. And so we are together with them in thinking about this. And the same is true in Palestine. In Palestine, people understand that being incarcerated is not a sign of moral failure. It's a sign of the Israeli occupation. But one of the problems in trying to build a new nation is what role incarceration will play in your plans. And so we've had some really rich conversations with people trying to think about how not to try and build up a nation in the image of those that have dominated.
Well said. I know that, for Palestinians, Gaza is known as the largest open air prison in the world. It's really quite something. I mean, the restrictions of movement, of food, of anything is quite remarkable. I wanted to ask you, I know we're coming to the close of this conversation. I know that a lot of things change over time. What do you hope will be, let's say 50 years from now, will become obsolete? That's obviously prisons is what you're, focused on right now. But do you see like some shifts that are happening, some things that 50 years from now we'll say, what were we thinking? And have they changed? I know that in your autobiography, Angela, you speak a little bit about what happened, 50 years ago as compared to what's happening today, and you look back at what you thought would have been and what is today, and so on. But I'd like to think ahead. What are we seeing? What is there on the horizon? You guys are public intellectuals. We want to use your brains and be able to get some insight about the future.
Well,
either one of you start. Yeah.
Okay, I would perhaps start with our current situation with COVID, and the ways in which this pandemic has been used as the opportunity for pharmaceutical firms and all kinds of medical industries to generate profit from the suffering of people. And of course, we could have never foreseen a pandemic such as this. But on on the other hand, it was kind of inevitable, precisely because of the ways in which the climate has been exploited by global capitalism. So I want us to think more about the ways in which capitalism is harming not only the lives of human beings, but the globe, our climate, our Earth. I want us to look toward indigenous people for leadership in this question. Now, I'll also say, since I know we're winding down, that there's no way that we can predict what is going to happen tomorrow. Just as no one could have ever suspected that a global pandemic would become the context for the development of a much more complicated consciousness about structural racism, not only in the U.S., but all over the world, really, because even people in South Africa are recognizing that their police forces are indicative of structural racism, even though the vast majority of the police are Black now. But they inherited the structures of apartheid. They have inherited racist structures. So I want us to be open enough and to be open-minded enough to accept what comes in the future, as even as we are entirely incapable of predicting what that might be. So I guess I'm suggesting we do the work of organizing, and we do the work of encouraging critical thinking, and we get people to recognize that we need an entirely new organization of our global societies.
Thank you, Gina.
Well, again, we're not prognosticators exactly, but I think it's, for me, more about being ready for the future. And a lot of that, and I think it's something Angela and I talk about a lot, we're happy to be teachers because we're always connected to young people. And that really helps. You can't be relevant to young people without staying abreast of what's going on, and without being ready for the future. And so I think our readying ourselves is really about trying to cultivate in ourselves the ideas that abolition teaches us, because really that's the hardest thing for each of us, is to, when someone hurts you, not to want to hurt them back, right? So all the ways that we are just in ourselves, never fully removed from that system of retributive justice, we try to work on that. And I think that's, when I think about the future, I think of that. I think about all the work that people are doing in Afrofuturism to try to think about what it means to think about another lineage for us. What does it mean? Because Afrofuturists, of course, are not just focused on what will be, but actually, having descended from something different, right? What if we, start to really think about our past and our heritage differently than we have. I think we're in this moment when, and I'm thinking about this more in a Black framework, but where we're struggling against Afro-pessimism and against a lot of the ideas that are locking us into being in a certain kind of relationship to the past that our book really tries to challenge. And so I think about all of that, and I think of future. Really, mostly what I hope is that we have one, because we haven't destroyed the planet, and we've been able to shift away from capitalism towards something that can sustain all life and all forms of life. And I know that sounds just as crazy saying that now as it sounded when we started talking about prison abolition 20 years ago. And I hope that it only takes 20 years for that to sound less crazy, and that we can all perhaps witness that, or at least a transition. This pandemic has only showed us what many of us already knew. either because we suffered from it or we studied it or both. And I think if we can start to ourselves live in the world as if we were in that future, which is more just, we will be able to then to all imagine together a future which allows us to keep a planet.
Mm. Your Angela, your Shiba Itsu was walking
Seneca, yeah.
behind, and people have asked to see it. So
one of two Shibas in the household. The other one we're not bringing out.
the other way, not bringing it out. Can we see that
No,
one?
well,
No,
maybe.
Yes. Here he is.
That's Shiba number one.
What's his name?
That's Seneca.
Seneca.
Well, hello, Seneca.
Named for Seneca Falls, Seneca Nation, Seneca the philosopher.
Seneca Village.
Seneca
And what's
Village.
the other one's name? What's the other one's name?
The other one's Sachiko,
Sachiko.
which means bliss.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Ours is named Yara, and Yara means friend in Farsi. So she's disappeared now with Marjan somewhere. But I want to thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I wish it was in person, but this is the closest thing we can get at this moment in time. But would love to have you back here in Washington, D.C. in the not too distant future, I hope.
Well, we always love to be with you all at Busboys, and we want to thank you for being a model for how to be in two times. You're in the time of doing business and in the time of making a new future at the same time.
Thank you so much. Oh, here's Yara. Come here, Yara. Come on. Yara.
Hey.
Come on. Yara. Let's say goodbye.
Try corralling a puppy. That's different.
I know.
Come here.
You're right.
There she is.
Oh, good.
Hey, for those of you that missed earlier, say hello.
Hello, Yara.
Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you again. And remind you guys, the books are available. And I think both Angela and Gina have agreed to sign the plates that we've sent to you, or we're going to be sending to you. So they will be signed by the authors. So we appreciate you. Thank you so much. And make sure that you buy your books from local independent bookstore. It doesn't have to be Busboys, but independent bookstores are important because they bring you these wonderful conversations. Until next time, take care.
Thank
Good
you
night.
so much, Andy. Goodbye.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.